So, these are interesting times for Final Fantasy XI. Recently, but after some previous indications in that direction, a famous streamer started playing Final Fantasy XI on his channel. And that's good news for the game, but there's something strange about the way Final Fantasy has been handled, not only by Square Enix, but by its player base. It's been more than 16 years by now, and there's plenty of content out there. But at least on video, most of it consists on people starting to play the game anew, or doing in-game activities like trying to get the new equipment, new weapons, or hunting certain notorious monsters. But there's something missing, and what I personally think is missing is that people are treating Final Fantasy XI, understandably, MMORPG, as an online game, which is fine, it's expected. But what no one seems to be treating Final Fantasy XI as is a Final Fantasy game, taking into account its story, its characters. It's exceedingly rare. There are some notable efforts. I must point out, first of all, Korvana's efforts in recording every single cutscene in the game. That's hours and hours of story. And even then, the game has more story than that's not told through cutscenes. So there's a lot to say about the game and its characters, and it's surprising and almost worrying that there isn't more content like that. That the wider Final Fantasy fandom isn't aware of the game's characters and major stories. I have this pet worry that if a character is not in the Cydia, most people don't know it as far as Final Fantasy XI is concerned. The Cydia wasn't the first game to include characters from 11, but the first one to include established characters was this Japanese arcade card game, Lords of Vermilion 2, which has plenty of guest characters, not only from Final Fantasy series, but also from other games, including Toho and King of Fighters. It's an interesting case, but it's not something most people can access. That game only featured villains, which is understandable. If you play as a character you created, the characters you can most expect to meet along the way are its antagonists. So it had Shadow Lord, Zealot Brothers, Kamlanot and Elden Arch, as well as Archangel Eevee, all antagonists. Eventually the Cydia came along. If they had to cover games up to at least 12, they had to cover 11 as well, so that forced a change. That forced a choice. In my opinion, could have been a better common choice, but there's an article where it's mentioned that Tetsuya Nomura made the choice in a very vague way, just wondering, Taru are popular, right? And that was the driving impulse have Shantoto represent her entire game. She's not a bad character, she's a fun character, she's powerful, she covers the Cydia's cast gaps. The game has a lot of young guys using swords, so the game could use women and mages, and Shantoto certainly covers for that, while having a distinct silhouette, which also always helps in a large cast of characters. But she's not representative of Final Fantasy XI's major stories. You can go through most of the game without meeting her or having her do anything of consequence. Even throughout her nation's story, she only plays a very small role. Her role was expanded over the years, but it's still a small role. She's not so much a character as a movable object, an unstoppable force. There's only so much you can do with that. But that's now the face of Final Fantasy XI for people who don't know the game. Later they also added Prish, who is a far more central character. she's specific to an expansion, but when you play through that expansion, you can't avoid meeting her. She's with you all the way. She fights alongside you in the final battle of her story. Fine, good choice, but she's not the... She lost the opportunity to be the first impression, so to speak. But I was talking about online efforts to represent the 11 story, and specifically mentioning Korvana. There's another interesting effort out there, which is Sync Weaver's lore videos for 11, which take an interesting but very understandable direction. Well, not sure if understandable, but useful direction, because they basically talk about the game's backstory before the events you actually play through. So you get a lot of the mythos and the history, including the Crystal War that's covered in the intro cutscene for the game, including the Crystal War that's covered in the opening animation for the game, and it stops there, so that if you actually decide to play through the game, none of what he tells you spoils you on the events. That's a good approach, but that's the thing. If you follow Syncweaver's videos, you see how the stage is set for the core game, because that's the thing. Syncweaver's videos don't actually cover backstory for the expansions that come later, so you don't get anything from Aturgan, you don't get anything from Adulin, and after Wings of the Goddess, the story also feels a bit more incomplete. And on the other side, there's Korvana, covers all of the cutscenes, but that's way more content than most people will digest. And while it's great while you're playing through the game, if you're watching it, the lack of audio for the voices and whatnot, a way to abbreviate what's going on, that lack might hurt the ability for someone new to the game, someone who's curious about it, to digest the major issues, who the major characters are, what the big events are. I mean, people can read about it. I mean, there are wikis that cover some of the story to some extent in an abbreviated way, but the more the years go by, the more I get the impression that people don't so much like to read and prefer just to listen to a video talking about it. I would have the inclination to criticize that, but frankly, it's quite frequent for me nowadays to play videos about all sorts of things while I'm working or doing other things, so I can understand that approach. I mean, if you want to hear about that Final Fantasy game no one ever talks about, it might be more practical to have something playing in the background and maybe try to simulate some of that than to go out of your way and read walls of text about it. That's the thing, there haven't been focused efforts on that. Not that there haven't been good efforts, good video efforts regarding Final Fantasy XI. On that department, outside strictly story stuff, I have to point out Sober Dwarf's videos. I mean, when you see, he mostly covers like the experience of playing through the game, concerns with present and future and history and whatnot, but when you see the way he arranges, the way he chooses his footage to go along with certain concepts, you can tell he gets it. It's probably never going to be his primary focus, although his most successful video is about Final Fantasy XI, but he gets it. Story-wise, as far as Vanadil as a world, it's a respectable effort. If you haven't checked his videos out yet, you should. The other major notable effort, I would say, would be Hunting for Games. He mostly covers the gameplay side of things, the experiences of playing through the game, favorite things and whatnot. But he's doing a pretty good job. He has a nice, pleasant voice, a nice, friendly tone to listen to. I mean, I worry that he uses the past tense a bit more than I would, considering the game is still active. But it's also a notable effort. But that's the thing. There are these great efforts out there, but nobody seems to be covering the story specifically, and I'm worried that at some point, if the game ever becomes unavailable, we'll only have like the cutscenes, some things people have written on the wikis and whatnot, and that's kind of it. And Final Fantasy XI as a world is the story is grand narrative, has a lot of interconnected parts with a lot of implicit aspects to it that I feel are worth analyzing. And I'm sorry, after all these years, I have the impression that, I mean, someone should have done it. I wish someone would, Hunting for Games' is pleasant tone of voice or Sword Dwarf's editing skills would take up the task, but nobody has, and I wonder I wonder if I should. I mean, I have started writing some scripts for some things, but I'm not terribly confident about my ability to read them eloquently and pleasantly for a curious audience. But I feel it must be done. I mean, I have something in the pipeline talking about multiple characters, trying to organize them. Considering there are so many of them, trying to organize them into Tarot Major Arcana. 22 characters and concepts. That's when a game is as big and has as many characters as Final Fantasy XI does, you don't like going for a trio or a 5-man band. That's not enough. You have to dozens and above. Another idea that's been floating around is doing a proper video on Shantoto, since she has become the de facto face of the game. And while there is a video about Shantoto out there, the guy clearly basically didn't just read off the wiki, but you won't find something in his video that you won't find in a wiki. And there's a lot to the character that crosses in interesting ways with the history of our city, the way it's organized, with a few other characters, some things that aren't obvious, but at a character level scale still feel kind of important. Might be worth addressing. She's not my favorite character, but she's too important to ignore, and even then there isn't enough about her out there. Other ideas that have been floating around is a bit of an analysis of the opening animation of the game, how that's reflected in the game, and how the game's updates actually try to catch up with the opening animation, and in at least one instance try to give it closure. That's when it's also been floating around in my head. And there are also other things might be worth covering, maybe not so story specific, like the pervasiveness of the game's elemental system. That's kind of a big one. On a more conceptual level, the way magic and religion are handled in the game. Mostly religion, because there are some interesting approaches there. Stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot to say about the game, but there's not actually much being said about the game's world and story in videos. Right, now that I think about it, there's something that keeps coming to mind about a specific area in the game that, when you analyze it a bit and its history, it says a lot about its world and some of its people. Konstadt Islands. It's the sort of thing I've written on occasion in topics about the game, but yeah, there's no video about it. Maybe I should do something about that. And of course, one of the things about the game that was most impactful to me was the ending to Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, and that deserves its own video, since there's so much to it. But it seems pointless to cover the ending. What serves as the ending to the game? One of them, in my opinion. I have this pet theory that, in a way, Final Fantasy XI has at least 3 endings for every time they thought the game might end. It kept going, so they added other stories that finished off other aspects of the game. So, yeah, there's that. But that's not the only ending. Well, that's not. Other than the Rhapsody's ending, I think there are also things worth saying about Chains of Promethea, which is often praised as one of the best expansions in the game, but when people talk about it, they usually talk about the difficulty of the fights, which certainly were difficult, especially with the level caps, but let's put it this way. The game was originally planned to last about 5 years, and Chains of Promethea was the last expansion released in that time span. So it gives the impression of them trying to put in everything they could about the game into that story. So throughout it, cover a lot of things, and I think it's worth going over just what they tried to do. Maybe if they succeeded, but there are a lot of things about Chains of Prometheus that I think are worth saying, sharing, and maybe even comparing with Rhapsodies of Anadil, which came later and actually has a lot of points in common with it. So there's that as far as things I think are still missing about things that are still missing regarding Final Fantasy XI content. And of course there are other issues. I mean, in the beginning I mentioned ongoing attention the game is getting due to a famous streamer playing the game. Some of the most interesting initiatives regarding Final Fantasy XI, the most interesting promotional initiatives regarding Final Fantasy XI haven't actually been organized by Square Enix, but by Famitsu. They've actually held a few streams about the game, and one of them was actually New Year's Eve. They actually got a bunch of actors to get a few people together and ran a stream where they had the game's developers. They had a short skit with Hironobu Sakaguchi. The people on stream got together and fought and played through some major fights. And there was even a bit of an artwork expansion, because when Rhapsodies of Anadil finished, there were a few illustrations released as wallpapers, and one of them was a big spread with a lot of the characters in the game. When the first of those streams was released, they had a counterpart to that, where the characters were on the right side of the artwork, but then on the left side they had player characters, customized characters, player generated characters using things players would use, along with a few references to things that are infamous among players, like crabs and colibri, and things like that. And then in a later stream they put in the avatars and Goddess Altana between those two crowds. It's been a nice little expansion. Not to mention that before those things, Famitsu actually did something that Square Enix did not, oddly, but they did it with Square Enix's cooperation. They actually had these story videos, took some major cutscenes of the game, and had relatively famous actors voice them. So that was the ending of the Shadow Lord fight, the ending to Treasures of Aturgan, the ending of Wings of the Goddess, and quite a few major scenes from Rhapsodies of Anadil. It's curious that for some of them they chose scenes that count as spoilers, but on the other hand they have dramatic impact. So there's that. But it's interesting that they recorded these things, they put them in their channel, and about 1 or 2 years ago they set those videos to private, which I do not understand. I don't know if it's an issue with the rights to use the voices from the actors, or if Square Enix had them take that down, or something like that, but it's a very strange phenomenon. I asked about it in the official forums. I got no reply. I worry. And that's not the only thing one can worry about regarding Final Fantasy XI. One recurring worry is that the game is under Square Enix's Division 5, which handles its online games. And the section in Division 5 is ran by the person running Final Fantasy XIV. So Final Fantasy XI is essentially under the management of someone who is responsible for its internal competition within the company, which makes me worry about what kind of effort and budget go into it. There have been some strange incidents regarding that. Like, for example, there was this New Year stream where Naoki Yoshida and a few other people were presenting multiple online games at the same time, but one of them was Final Fantasy XIV, the other was Dragon Quest X, and the other was Phantasy Star Online 2. But Final Fantasy XI wasn't invited for whatever reason. And then at a later time, Naoki Yoshida is also on record as saying that for a company to run more than one MMORPG at the same time is unnatural, which is a bit of a cause for concern. Although in a more recent interview, he made some more promising and optimistic statements about the game, so I wonder if something is changing about the relationship between the games. Maybe 11 currently has better player retention than 14. I don't have the numbers, I don't have the information Naoki Yoshida has, but I wonder if something is changing or is becoming clear. And of course there's the peculiar horizon of a mobile version, which I'm personally concerned about, since I absolutely doubt that the limitations of a mobile game can do justice to the world that Final Fantasy XI currently represents. The intricacy of the mechanics, all the control options, not only general movement and menus and whatnot, but also things like macros, all sorts of things you can do at once, region-specific mechanics, all sorts of things related to monster, for example, skills that require facing an opponent or a victim, things like that. I wonder how much of that risks being cut due to the limitations of mobile. I mean, at this point, it seems like the implementation will be almost entirely different. I mean, they'll probably try to implement the core regions of the game, maybe some established characters, but it will probably take a very long time for a mobile version to catch up with the main game's current content. And apparently one of the roles Nexon was hiring for was to write quests, so one wonders if something about the story will change or will be disregarded in favor of quests that work better for a mobile medium. I don't know, but my concern is preservation. I think it would be a major loss for Final Fantasy as a series if a lot of content of one of its mainline titles was lost, or at least became unavailable in its original form forever. And this is already a concern for the original version of Final Fantasy XIV. I still think that one should be converted into a single-player prequel to at least retain the quests and the dialogue and all of that. The game had problems, but it also had some good elements there that I still think that they should bring back in some capacity. But yeah, I'm concerned about the mobile version and what it risks leaving out, and the risk of that limited version being 11's future. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that one of the mainline games got functionally replaced with a remake. This happened with Final Fantasy III, originally on the NES, never officially localized. Maybe it got some improvements. Some people still prefer the NES original. Personally think that trying to replace the original player-defined characters with established named characters maybe didn't work as well as it should. I mean, new established characters basically don't have much of a combat identity of their own, as far as I can tell. But that's a minor point. At least the NES version has been emulated. There are fan translations. People can go back and experience that. With Final Fantasy XI, there's a risk for it and for its series, since it's dependent on two major issues, which are PlayStation 2 development kits to develop content for it, and it's also heavily limited by Play Online, which, if you have experienced it or heard about it, you know how much of a problem it makes. So I think the best opportunity for 11 to have a major future is to either change its infrastructure to get rid of Play Online, or to at least to retain its stories and world content, to adapt it to a single player version. It wouldn't be easy, but they already have all the assets they need. Basically, you need to recode the backend, maybe change a few things. It would give them the opportunity to streamline a few things, like, for example, at the end of the Shadow Lord fight, you get a certain ending, but you get the real ending when you start the Zillard missions sometime later. And if the game was revised, be it in a remake or a single-player version, they you could unify those moments since they happen. Those cutscenes are triggered in completely different places. Things like that. Maybe having established characters fight alongside you in scenes where they were present but they didn't actually fight alongside you. That only came later in the game's lifespan. That sort of thing. Yeah, these are basically my concerns. Not enough story content, not enough videos out there about the game's story. Mobile is the future of the game, which I'm not optimistic about. Possibilities to perpetuate the game. It's a single player experience, or as a restructured online game. And there's also another thing is that as far as game preservation as a whole, especially games that rely on connection to a server to function, if a mainline Final Fantasy game cannot ensure its future, what chances do other games have? There have been advances in that direction recently. If one of the big ones, at least as far as company support or longevity goes, if a game that's been around for so long and has such a big company behind it can preserve its future, I think the future of games will be poorer than it should be. I think Final Fantasy XI might be a good focus of attention to try and see what can be done. If it can be saved, maybe others can be too. At this point, I've probably been rambling for too long. I've been reluctant to read off a script, so I guess I'm trying something more natural. I hope this was an interesting enough use of your time. I wonder if trying more stuff like that will be a good use of mine. So for now, take care, have fun, and, if enough people like this kind of thing, maybe there'll be more for the future. See ya.